We're going to go ahead and get started because I know it's late on a Friday afternoon. I'm really excited about this, but you know what I'm also excited to do? Go home. We're going to start it so we can have a really great discussion, and then we can all go home and start the weekend. Have a seat if you don't be too scared to come sit in front. I am not contagious with anything right now. We're all good. Like I said, my name is Braeden Jones. I work jointly in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese with the General Education Department, and also here in the CLCL. And in one of my weekly meetings with Claire, our director, we were talking about gender-inclusive language and how we wanted to do something. And she had been talking with Christine Shea and Will Coghill-Barons down in the College of Education. And she was like, well, you should be in charge of this. You take care of this because it's something that matters a lot to you. And Claire's doing a bajillion things, so she was like, please take the reins with this. And I was very excited about it. So this is going to be the first of multiple events this semester where we talk about gender inclusion. And I wanted it to not be me-focused, even though I am an angry, queer, non-binary person. That's maybe not the right person to be in charge because I'll just say mean things the whole time. Especially this week. It's been a very hard week to be a queer person in this country or to be a trans person in this country, as I'm sure that many of you can either sympathize and or empathize with. The Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, the whole debacle with trans kids in Texas right now. It's really hard right now. It feels kind of like this country wants to kill me for being me, which is not very easy. But thankfully, I know that's not true because I know there's people like you everywhere who want to learn to be supportive and who want to, and myself, I want to learn to be supportive to my queer and trans brothers and sisters. My not only brother, I'm a non-binary person. Why do I say brothers and sisters? Because it's ingrained in me. Because that's how gendered language works. And that's why we're going to talk about that today. So today, like I said, is our first round table. I'm really grateful to our three presenters who are going to talk. We have Mari here, who's going to talk to us about what's happening in Portuguese and kind of how gender inclusivity and neutrality is working in Portuguese. We have Emerson here, who's going to talk about Spanish, and Abby, who's going to talk about French. I know this is very Romance language focused. We tried to get some people from other languages to come in, but many of them are actually here in audience, but they were like, I'm too busy to be on the round table, but I want to be at the round table so I can contribute. And like I said, this is going to be our first event, but I think it's really interesting to start with Romance languages because of how gendered they are to their core. Because Latin was such a gendered language, all of Latin's offshoots remain so. And the ways in which we can grapple with that and try to make our language more inclusive and more open to people of all and people of all persuasions and people of all types. You know what I mean? So, with that said, which of you three wants to go first? I know all three of you have done really great work in this field. I know that many of you have done projects about this kind of stuff. Does one of the three of you want to volunteer to talk a little bit about your language first? Figure something out as fast as possible. Abby, why don't you start us off down there at the end?
With all my paper? Okay.
Yeah, with all your papers.
Hi. So I did a project last semester on how to create gender-inclusive pedagogy in French. As Braeden mentioned, French is a highly gendered language. The rule of masculine predominance reigns supreme. So if there's a group of 99 women and 1 man, you would use the French, grammatically speaking, the French masculine pronoun il. In terms of its formal recognition, the Académie Française, which a lot of you speak Spanish, is a similar sort of body. It's a legislative body. It was founded in 1635 by Cardinal Richelieu.
That Cardinal Richelieu?
That guy.
Like
that
Three Musketeers, Cardinal Richelieu?
Yeah, that dude.
So the villain from the start is what you're
saying.
Yes,
basically. They are still deeply, they deeply disavow gender-inclusive language. But there's positive news. Everyone else kind of doesn't. That's the thing. Most universities in France now include what we call the median point. So if you have 2 forms of the adjective accords, they write them out, right? They do, let's see, il est paresseux. So you would have the X to mark the masculine, the SE to mark the feminine, and they put a dot so that in writing, both the feminine and the masculine are represented. So universities like the Sorbonne, when I was studying abroad there, include that in their university communications. Most podcasts now, one of the most famous feminist podcasts in France, La Poutre, uses the gender-neutral pronoun IEL. As of November 2021, it was officially added to the French dictionary, the gender-neutral version of they. There are many versions, but that's the one that's probably the most courant, the most used. In response, every centrist and sort of right politician in France went on Twitter rampages. It was excellent. Fucking decrying the use of the language, but there is a real dissonance between what's like officially codified and legislated in France, the French metropole, versus how youth use it, how it's used by certain universities and other bodies. And I'd also like to mention there's some distinction between France, Europe, and other French-speaking countries. For example, Quebec in Canada has a really rich and long history of thinking about ways to not only use gender-inclusive language, that means including both the feminine and the masculine, but also gender non-binary language. We're thinking about ways to circumvent gender altogether when we're talking about, when we're using the language. So that's like an important distinction. I think the feminization of like job titles and this inclusion of the feminine has existed for a long time in France, since like the 1960s, when there was sort of this radical feminist turn in France. But the gender non-binary language pedagogy has only existed, I would say, in the last 5-10 years. So we can talk more about that, but that was a little bit all over the place, but I think it's a good introduction. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, like you said, I think that we'll see similar currents in the other languages where like the big grammar orgs are like, never. And then the people are like, oh, what do we care what you say anyway? All right, interesting.
Always on Twitter.
Yes.
It's always on Twitter.
Everyone's showing their whole asses on Twitter.
I took screenshots.
And that's when the word wokisme in French, W-O-K-I-S-M-E, that's when it came into usage, right? So the wokisme, it's a way of mocking
Oh my God.
American wokeness. But in any case, yeah.
All right, so let's see what's happening in Spanish.
I was gonna say, I might not know kind of like the history part of it, but more so kind of coming into this not in terms of doing a project or anything, but as a queer trans person coming to the university and asking friends and fellow classmates, you know, what gender neutral they them pronoun is there? I don't know if I should maybe call it the conversation, but it was a conversation in Giovanni's teaching world languages with Oriette, where we were kind of discussing, because at the time I was using they them pronouns, like what option is there for non-binary people in Spanish? And she was actually the person that mentioned ella to me. So hats off to Oriette. I can't not be up here and not mention her. But over like of course my own kind of journey with my trans identity, moving more to the he, him aspect, it's still super important to me as a teaching assistant instructor, language instructor, to make sure that my students feel represented in the classroom. Especially since I've noticed over the past year, kind of like an increasing amount of students who have so virtually shared their pronouns with me as either being strictly they, them, or a combination of he and they, or she and they, or use of any of the pronouns. And I always just want to make sure that my students feel comfortable, that they know that even in a very, very gendered language, that they can feel represented. But to talk about the RAI, the Royal Spanish Academy, which somebody on Twitter named as, La RAI is like the Pope, essentially. Is what they said. But I had heard about this, or I was looking into kind of like what the current stance is on using AJ, E-L-L-E, in Spanish to refer to non-binary people that use they, them pronouns. And I learned very recently that the RAI created this portal in fall of 2020 called Observatory on Worlds, which came out in October 2020. that includes terms and expressions that aren't in the Spanish language dictionary of RAI, but have been discussed or debated. I might have some confusion about, which I thought was really interesting. Lo and behold, the portal did include a definition for ege, which says that the pronoun ege is a solution created and promoted in certain sectors to refer to those who may not feel identified with either of the two traditionally existing genders. Its use is not widespread or well established. I feel I can attest to, because in my whoever knows how long journey with Spanish, it took till 2019 to learn that there is tittering of the use of ege. And of course, there was just absolute shitstorm on Twitter about it. It's from both ends, no? But one of them, in support, people in support, obviously, which is where the Pope comment came in, a posting of the screenshot of the entry saying, "Hello, the RAI incorporated the pronoun ege. This is a very strong acknowledgement given their resistance. The RAI is a bit like the Pope. We don't care what they say, but what they say is a battle won," which was just that recognition is super important. However, very quickly, I believe that this creation either of the portal or this entry of ege, I believe it was like October 27th, 2020. October 31st, 2020 is when the RAI took down the post. Yep.
4 whole days.
A glorious 4 whole days. We had them for 4 days. But again, on Twitter, which is so interesting, that I responded to some user talking about it, being like, "Oh, well, the post isn't there anymore when I go to search for it." And I said, "Thank you for your interest. Due to the confusion generated by the presence of ege and the observatory words, it has been considered preferable to remove this entry. When the role and functioning of this section is more comprehensive, it will be reassessed." It has, as far as I know, has not been reassessed. So I think it's like the Pope, but I really think that at this point, for me, it's super impactful to continue the conversation, even in your, as little as your classrooms. Even a classroom isn't that little because it's big for your students. Yeah. It's in the Merriam-Webster dictionary.
Well, there you
But
go.
that's nothing. But that's something.
And so what's happening in Portuguese in comparison with the other 2 languages? Is it similar? Are there differences? What's happening?
Yeah, it's very similar because, like in Spanish, Portuguese is a binary language, and it's interesting that Emerson mentioned that it's important to make our students feel comfortable, because that's exactly how I started to feel more interested in the topic, because I've been teaching Portuguese for some time, and I realized that the course books, they don't mention this language, gender inclusive language. So this is something that I started to think what can be done in order to change this context, or how to make students more aware. So yeah, in Portuguese, and I'm speaking of Brazil more specifically, because that's where I come from, we had an attempt to add the X at the end of the words, but then it didn't work very well because of some systems that couldn't read the words. And then we started to implement the pronoun I-L-E, at the end of this is the type of language. I think there are other 3, but the one that I could find more information about was ILI. And I think it started in this ILI system starting in 2015. I couldn't find information on where it started, but I know there is a manifesto written by psychologist that she describes how people can use the EV system. But yeah, I think it's very similar to.
is there a lot of pushback from, I know more about Spanish because that's my language of study, and like, even though Latin America is my area of study, the RAI's influence is unmistakable. Like, what the RAI says is also what your regional Latin American places generally say. So I was curious, is there like a large body like that that is the ruler of all grammar when it comes to Portuguese?
Yeah, and I think, well, on the internet, we have this movement of people encouraging the use of gender-inclusive language, but Brazil is now under a very conservative government, so a lot of representatives and government, they don't support this language, and many influencers on YouTube and Twitter, Instagram, they are against. There's even a law that is trying to block like the use of gender-inclusive language in public institutions. I think this is the main
Yeah.
pushback.
Wow. So I think it's really interesting that the X was a thing that they tried and then kind of tossed to the side. Because I know the same thing has largely happened in Spanish. In like US Spanish, there's been a big movement to start using the X as a gender neutral ending on words. But that doesn't really work in Spanish. Like, you can read it just fine, but trying to say it makes it kind of a mess, which is why I think there's been a very quick uptake in the use of ella instead, that E-L-L-E. I wonder if that's the same in French. Were there any kind of movements or evolutions of those gender neutral terms, or did they kind of pick one and kind of go with
there's
it?
like, I noted 6 iterations of different gender neutral pronouns. You have yel, yil, oi, al, yul, and al. And for some reason, yel, I-E-L was the one that was most commonly said a lot. I think because it incorporates sort of letters from il and l, but I don't know if there's like a specific intention behind it.
Okay, so it's like the one that's the most representative of the two
Yeah,
mixing, because I feel
yeah.
the same way in a lot of respects with AJ in Spanish, where like it's el is the masculine, ella is the feminine, and so by putting that E in there, it's like double L's facing
Yeah,
each
it's
other,
like
but
doing
also
double
ella, so
meaning.
it kind of does mix the two.
Yeah.
What's the deal, that most popular one in Portuguese? Is it kind of a mix of the two, or is it another word?
Well, we have for each, we have for the article and for the variation that I found is
Sure.
ili, Gili for dela e dele, like
Oh,
her
okay,
and hers.
sure.
Aquele, aquela is aquele. Nele, nela e nele is nele. Essa e esse, which is this and that, would be esse. Daquele, daquela, daquele. Sua e seu, sui. Nossa e nosso, nossi. Minha e meu, me. So mine and for men and the masculine and the feminine would be mini. So I think that's the
Interesting.
relative.
Interesting.
And I was trying to like check if probably they would be possible to mix to read in a way that is confusing, but I don't think it would be confused using this system.
Yeah, so it follows I think this is true of all 3 of the languages, where they have found ways to incorporate it that still follow the basic structure of the language. Like, this should be an easy adopt for people, and the reason why it gets so much cultural pushback does feel like a cultural thing, not like a grammatical thing where it's like, this is hard for me to wrap my head around. I mean, again, Spanish is my language of study, so I'm going to always take it back to Spanish. But in Spanish, you just throw the O and the A off in the garbage and put an E, and it's easy peasy. It's the easiest thing in the world.
I love how you just summarize the whole gender system of the language. You just throw off the A, you throw off the O, and there you go.
I mean,
As a linguist, you
it's a
realize
lot more
this is-
complicated than that.
Does it not make us feel rather anxious as a linguist?
But here's the thing, is that I understand that there are huge systems, but it's also just really easy to ignore them and throw E's on the end of things.
Well,
Like,
Can I
extremely
just make
easy.
one point that I think has been very interesting in this conversation? I think there's a difference between gender neutral language, inclusive language, And what I've heard in a couple of cases and also in other discussions along these lines about a gendered language. They're not quite the same thing, at least not to my mind. Perhaps if somebody would like to debate that with me, fine, but, or clarify for me if I've misunderstood. But, I mean, table has grammatical gender in Spanish, right? People have inherent gender, right? So it's not the same idea. So when you're talking about a gendered language, that's something else. I'm not sure if I'm aware of the term gendered language. A language that has gender, that has grammatical gender, is what we would say.
Yeah.
And that is things like la mesa, you don't say el mesa, right?
Sure, I would.
So that is one thing, but then the
Okay.
conversation, from what I understand, kind of the conversation today is about gender neutral pronouns, right? And
Sure.
gender neutral language.
Sure.
So
And-
just sort of clarifying the difference between grammatical gender,
Sure.
which nobody should have any problems with grammatical gender, and gender when it is related to humans or animals, and that is where
100%.
like, gender inclusive language will come into play.
100%.
Because sometimes you hear people questioning, oh, pues, y ahora tengo que decir el mesa, okay. El mesa, no, of course you don't. That's not what we're arguing.
Sure.
That is not what we're hoping for, right?
Sure. I received an email
Because there are some studies
Yeah.
about like how a gender language actually affects your conception of things.
Oh, for sure.
When you start using adjectives for describing a word that in Spanish is feminine word, say la mesa, then sometimes you are more like prone to use adjectives that you would use, that you associate with like a feminine concept of the thing. So when we actually, the thing is that trying to change that would be a lot. But if we happen to perceive the world and the objects as genderless, because actually, table has no gender, how would that change our perspective?
Sure.
On how we approach the things? But like that's just, I think it's more of a theoretical debate right now. Instead, the gender pronouns is something we can do and we can teach. Right?
For sure.
Yeah, totally. And
I-
it should be taught, has to be taught. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's a thing that we're talking a lot about. I did want to say, Becky Gonzalez wrote me an email. She was not able to make it today. She had something else going on. But she had a really great conversation about this in her Portuguese class that she wanted to mention if I could work it in the conversation. And it fits perfectly with what you're talking about, Christine. Again, another linguist. Talking about like grammatical language versus what she called, I think in the email, lexical
Yeah.
language, where it is that like malleable thing where you're talking about, okay, how do we use gender inclusivity or gender neutrality for people? But again, la mesa es la mesa es la mesa.
Well, or possibly not.
But again, that's a much larger theoretical project, whereas, what we can do right now is we can try to make our students feel included in the classroom. Because, I think Emerson made a good point, and I think it's very true. I am seeing a lot more, as I work with students, people who are clearly identifying their gender, whether that is, clearly one of the binary genders or as non-binary. A lot of people are choosing to put it on their icon profile so that when I look them up to add them to a test, I can immediately see they, them, or she, her, or he, him, or she, they, or any of these things, or they'll put it on their Maui site. So it helps me know how to approach that student when I speak to them and to do so respectfully. Yeah.
I wanted to make one other point that I think also can sort of help people, if you ever have to push back on this issue with people, to ask them, if they're a Romance language speaker, ask them why they're not speaking Latin. If they're an English speaker, why you're not speaking, what, Anglo-Saxon or wherever the heck English came from? Well, of course you're not, because language changes. Language changes. It has to change or else it dies. It just changes, but we don't want it to. Like pearl clutching about how language changes and the young people nowadays don't know how to speak. Well, this has been going on ever since God knows when, probably from Latin until to the vulgar Latin, right, which became Spanish and etc. So I think that's also a way of, if you get any pushback on this, which people shouldn't, but if you do, just emphasize the fact that language is not static, thank goodness. It's constantly changing.
Definitely. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about certain words in Spanish that even if they end in an E, they are still read as mostly masculine, like for example, padres, profesores, presidentes, like for example, we had this problem in Spain where they would start calling the woman president of Congress presidenta as in a diminishing way. So they started calling calling her like, no, they would call her presidente as a diminishing way, and she would start asking to be called la presidenta, although because it ends in an E, it should be gender neutral. So I wonder, especially if we're trying to teach this or write using the E as an alternative to the cis heteronormative way of using A and O's, what do we do with the substantives and adjectives that already finish on an E? And how do we make a swipe on that?
That is a good question that I don't think there's a good answer to right now. But it's definitely a thing to think about. I had not really thought about it that way.
Yeah, but many of these words in Spanish and in E come from Latin because in Latin there was a neutral gender. And now we have like sort of appropriated them as the masculine general. So I would say it's more about the way we end up using these words, like reestablishing maybe some of their meaning. So let's say like we could use the word presidente in a gender neutral way. We could try, right?
In Portuguese, in the manifesto that I mentioned, in this case for presidente and professor, they would add the IES, so it would be presidentes.
Oh.
So it wouldn't be the same as the masculine.
Well, there you go, Spanish. There's an idea for us, how we can change that.
To add on to that, in French, you would say Madame la Présidente.
So A is, because in Spanish, I don't think
It'd be a little
That's
hard in
the
Spanish.
Or you can use le.
Le. You use le.
Or L.
Or ella presidente.
Or L. Because of the leísome in Spanish?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's very complicated. Yes, Jenna, I want to hear from you, and then I would love to, before we start talking about how we use this in the classroom, I'd love to open it up to some of our people from other languages, non-Romance languages, just for a quick primer, 30 seconds to a minute. What's happening in German? What's happening in Japanese, if at all? But Jenna, what do you have to say?
A couple questions, and one of them actually kind of leads back to like the pedagogy of the classroom, so I will sit back and let you guys answer that. But in English, there's yes, you have the he and the she, and then you are starting to use they, which very reductionist, and it could be, some can take offense, but they sometimes is an encompassment of both. Then there's other sets of pronouns like zes and zir, and
Neopronouns.
there's these other neopronouns, and so that are like a rejection of the binary entirely, and rather than saying I'm gender fluid, gender queer, I am agender, non-gender, whatever it may be. Are there movements like that in some of these Romance languages where it's not necessarily a gender neutral phrasing, but it's almost like a rejection of gender altogether? Are there multiple sets of pronouns that can help identify this for somebody?
I haven't seen it as much. I've seen it occasionally in Spanish. I don't know if y'all have seen it in French and Portuguese. I've seen it very rarely in Spanish. But the same is also true of neopronouns in English. I even know people who use neopronouns, but I don't know, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the most popular neopronouns are, because that's part of the point of neopronouns, is they throw the entire idea of gender and pronouns into the garbage can. Just like I was joking about earlier, they literally do it when you start using neopronouns.
Right.
So I think it's really complicated, and I think that while there's a lot of pushback culturally on the use of they, it's way easier in English because we've already all been doing it when we didn't know the gender of the person we were talking about.
Right.
Like, yeah, there are the old heads who would say he, she, whatever, but they're the old heads. Like, even before we started using they, we would use they often when we talked about someone we didn't know the gender of. And so it's a lot easier, I think, for us to do it in English because that current is already there. Again, there's the old axiom about how Shakespeare was doing it back in the 1600s, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal for you. And I don't know whether that's true or not. I can't think of a time Shakespeare did it, but it shouldn't be a big deal. But it's easier. And so that's why it's easier for us to move past even the non-binary pronoun to the neo-pronoun, I think, in English, because there's already an easier tradition to build on of
Exactly.
using non-gendered language that was kind of skirting around the norms of he, she. But I think that that's in a different spot in these more gendered languages. But like I said, before we start talking about pedagogy, what's going on in other languages? Are there movements? How gendered are those languages even? I don't even know. Bruce, what's the story?
German has 3 genders, masculine, feminine, neuter. But having the neuter doesn't necessarily make things easy because, just in terms of the, the third person singular, people who identify as non-binary don't want to be called it because that feels sort of dehumanizing.
Dehumanizing, yeah.
And so there are some neo-pronouns that have been developed. Interestingly enough, one of the obvious choices is actually to use the English they. So people are essentially code switching and sticking the English they them into German sentences, which is really weird.
But also cool.
I did this with one of my classes last year. Even just reading the example sentences, I find it very difficult to get through them. Just because it's just like this it feels very awkward. But again, like all of these things, I think if you do it enough,
Well, and it feels like growing pains. It was like when the X was first starting being used, maybe a decade ago is when I first started seeing the X used in Spanish. And I could read it and understand what it was saying, but then when it was time for me to try to read it out loud, I was like, oh boy. Bienvenidix is like, I don't know how to do this.
That's what I was going to ask. How do people actually pronounce the X when they talk?
It depends on who you talk to. That is as malleable as the use of the X itself. Some people will make an X sound. Some people will just say an E sound even though it has an X there, I think is the most common among Spanish speakers. So you would just say bienvenides instead of XS, bienvenidixes, because that's a mess and hard to say. But I think that's why the X really exploded in popularity and is very fast disappearing. It is, like I see it in Latinx, and that is about it at this point. It has completely disappeared from the circles that I go in, except for when you see Latinx still. So I think it's been really interesting to see how fast that adoption of AJ has happened, but also partly. So what's the story with Japanese?
Japanese is not a gender language in the way that Roman languages are, but we do have a the pronouns she and he, and I am actually not sure if people are trying to come up with a gender neutral pronoun yet. I have to check, but I thought about why I'm not aware of it or I haven't heard about it, and then I realized it's because it's a product language. So we try not to use the particles she and he anyways. We try to use that person's name, and so that hasn't become a big issue yet.
Interesting.
But we have gender is an issue in a different way. So we have this marker that we put at the end of the sentence to express speaker's emotion or attitudes toward the event, and it's an optional. So even if you don't use it, it doesn't become ungrammatical. It's an extra thing that people use in communication, and so it's very difficult for students to get the meaning of these particles, and so that's one thing. But also, these particles are associated with a particular gender. So there are like more feminine particles and there are more masculine particles. And so in class, like I think usually the teachers tell students, okay, these are feminine particles, these are masculine particles, these are used by both genders. And the problem is that students think that Japanese is a sexist language. And so some students refuse to use those particles. And then they're missing a lot of information in the actual communication. And another thing is that, so even though we say these are feminine, these are masculine, it's not the case that all male use these particular particles or all females use particular. It's more complex in the reality. And so I was thinking that maybe so it's a problem, but it's also a way, if we can show that, it's a way for them to show their, identity, maybe, you know, they can, so I think what happens is that the gay people in Japan, they use some of the so-called feminine particles, and that's how they come up with their own styles, speech style. And so if you talk more about this, like maybe, you know, language classroom can be a place that they, you know, all students are going to feel empowered because they can kind of control the use of the particles to, you know, show their identity. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for letting us know. That is, again, as a person whose native language is English and who learned Spanish and then French and Portuguese in my grad work, those are just all the same language with little differences. Like, they're just it's all just Latin with the serial numbers filed off, and so they all follow a lot of the same rules. So it's really interesting to see how this is a completely different system. So thank you for sharing. And I definitely, you know, we talked about it beforehand. I'd love to have you on a future panel when you're not quite so busy, but I know you're very busy right now. But thank you anyway. So now I kind of want to talk about pedagogy. So we've talked about kind of the state of the language as it stands right now. And I know all three of you are teaching right now. So how do you incorporate these things into your classroom? How do you teach them to your students? How do you present them, even though, you know, I don't know about French and Portuguese, but in Spanish, that ain't in our book. Like, I think we have in many respects, very fine textbook, but it is also a very traditional textbook, so it is not going to have that kind of stuff in it. So how do you introduce those things to your students? How do you, you know, try to help them grapple with those things while they're also doing all the other things that come with learning a language for the first time? Once again, who wants to go first?
I can go.
Go for it, Maria.
So last semester we had this class with Giovanni, and one of my projects was a lesson plan on gender inclusive language. And my idea was to have a class where students could have a debate. So, and I can also share the lesson plan if you are interested in taking a look. So I would show a video that explains this, how the language started to be incorporated in Brazil. And then I would give them different articles that has different views. So they would have to debate. I haven't had the chance yet to apply this lesson, but I think it's an idea if you want to have something more focused. But something that I'm also trying to do is when I teach professions, I add for example, if I'm teaching like professor, professora, professor, professori. So I add the third word. And also something that we can work on is adding different pictures in the slide presentation, not only using the ones from the book, but also being more diverse when it comes to the image that we use.
Yeah. What about the other of you two?
I was going to say I do very much of the same thing. AJ is in all of my conjugation tables, it's in my worksheet examples that I give to my students. It's whenever we're talking about a new grammar topic like professions we just recently did, including the professore or another one. I was going to say medico. It's a little bit different. It's another kind of change you have to make with the QQ. But yeah, just constantly using examples, making time to pause and talk about it, and answer people's questions if they have any. I'm constantly talking about AA every chance I get, which I've already had students say how much they appreciate doing that.
Yeah.
Because yeah, there's not a lot in protagonistas. Actually, there's nothing.
There's none. As a person who was one of the two people who selected that textbook, I can tell you there ain't nothing in there about that. But that's true of literally all of them, because we looked at a dozen and none of them talked about gender neutral or gender inclusive pronouns at all.
And if you don't talk about it, then how students will know or be interested.
Amen.
Yeah, I think Emerson's point is really important. I think often we see gender inclusive language playing like fringe or taboo, but in reality it operates in the same ways that grammar works. So I also included, like, there are subject pronouns and reflexive pronouns and demonstrative pronouns that are all gender neutral options in French, and they follow that same, the same sort of logic. And then I also wanted to emphasize there are lexically, right, we haven't built an entire gender inclusive language in French, but there are ways to speak in French that circumvent questions of gender. So it starts as early as, instead of saying bonjour à tous, right, the masculine version, bonjour à tous et toutes, and I get questions about why I say that, and that opens up ways in which I can tell them how they talk, when the ways in which they talk don't have to be gendered. It's like a very common one, right? We learned early on, I study at the University of Iowa, and you could say, je suis étudiant, or je suis étudiante. And the second version is feminine. A very, very easy strategy is the circumlocution, right? J'étudie à l'Université de l'Iowa. And teaching them that in concert when they're learning adjectives really early on is super helpful. The other thing I wanted to mention is I think that I've found students who are interested in it can see it as this like space of really interesting discovery and play. So I had a student last semester whose sibling is non-binary and came to me after class and was like, we are doing like a unit on family and it's just frères et sœurs, and like tell me what to do. And I knew there were neologisms out there to talk about sibling, and I was like, here's some resources, you do it and come back to me and tell me what you found. And I knew too, right? I saw Frère and Adele, he came to me at like 15, were like, here's what's happening on Twitter, here's what's happening on Word Reference, because just as much as the internet is a very toxic place for genderqueer people, it's also been a space of like amazing creativity and linguistic experimentation. And then the last thing I wanted to make a point about is I have a very dear friend and scholar who's gender fluid, and I first heard it from them, is instead of just using IEL, like the gender neutral they, they're actually like very purposefully mismatch French pronouns and adjectives. So instead of saying il est beau, they would say il est belle. So there's a very intentional placing of two things next to each other in order to say, guess what, like this gender binary that you're sort of imposing on me is kind of fucked up. And when I first told this to other people, they're like, wait, doesn't that mean they don't understand gender? I'm like, actually, you actually need to understand French really well in order to intentionally mismatch these sort of formulations. So I just wanted to make that point that like, even within the constraints of a gendered language, there can be this like enormous space for play and rediscovery. And I think that that's what I love sharing with my students and them sharing with me. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's the exact thing that we were talking about. Spanish is not quite ready to do yet. To be like, it's not la mesa, it's el mesa, and that's fine. And because I'm breaking out of the binary altogether. So that's really interesting to hear that there are people like on the vanguard doing that exact thing. That's very cool. I would just say, as a person who is currently in the process of writing a textbook, how important that is to make it fundamental. Like all three of you said, where you make it fundamental to your lessons, it's a really tight balancing act to walk as you're writing a textbook, because you want it to be a textbook that's going to be open and inviting for other people to use, because we're trying to write this. This is an open educational resource. Giovanni, Rachel Cleaver, Gabi Oliveira from UNI and I are working on an elementary 1 Spanish textbook, in case any of you didn't know, because we're trying to phase out Protagonistas. Again, Protagonistas is a pretty good book. It's also way too damn expensive. It's like $200, and that is $200 too much. And Giovanni and I have always been really concerned about that sort of stuff, which is why he especially, this has been a big push on his ever since he got here, is to move into the realm of OERs. As many of you might know, he has one that is finished, published, and being used at other institutions, which is his education, Spanish for Educators. Spanish for Healthcare should hopefully be done this year and also being used other places this fall. And then we're working on an ad hoc intermediate 2 book to use until we can get around to writing a full one. And we're working on this full with this team elementary 1 book. And it is hard to walk that line of being like, we want this to be open and inviting for people to be able to pick up and immediately use in whatever institution they teach at, from a big R1 that's got really wide views on inclusivity and openness and those sorts of things to maybe a more smaller conservative institution, maybe a religious institution, something like that. But we also want to be true to who we are and who the people who speak Spanish are. And so finding a way to like make sure that we are teaching the rules, but also teaching these other rules as they currently stand. One of the benefits of doing it in an OER is that if in 2 years those kinds of rules have changed, oh, we just changed them in the book. That's one of the nice things about it not being a paper copy, being an electronic resource. But it is a thing that we're incorporating. And other things like that that we're thinking about as we're putting the book together. When we're making, for example, our vocab lists at the end of chapters, we just decided, and we have a disclaimer at the start of each of our vocab lists, adjectives, we're putting the feminine adjective, period. You know how to change it to a masculine adjective if you want. But we don't want to have to do O/A/E at the end of every stinking adjective. So we just decided, when we sat down at the start of the book, we were putting the feminine adjective because it is easier to convert back from the feminine to the masculine than it is to the sometimes where it gets weird from masculine to feminine. So that's what we did, and then we say, this is how you change it back to masculine, here's how you change it to a gender neutral term, and here's the list in feminine form. So it's one of those things that like we're trying to keep in mind as we do that. Or like examples, you know, textbooks like to bring in people, which is always a double-edged sword because then your textbook is published and the students are like, who the heck was that? I don't know how many times that's happened to me. I'm sure that's happened to all of y'all if they have, oh, here's this famous soccer player, and then your students are like, A, they don't know crap about soccer, and B, even if they do know about soccer, they don't know who this soccer player from Argentina was from 20 times. So it is a double-edged sword, but we're trying really hard to make sure that those are inclusive too. You know, we were like, oh, we want to bring in and talk about these different performers. So here is, you know, this, you know, Argentinian American performer. Here's this Colombian American performer. We want somebody non-binary in this list. So we were like, Demi Lovato's right there. You know, their dad is Mexican American. They came out as non-binary in 2018. They're perfect for us to put in this list. Use these non-binary adjectives and use them as an example of, here's someone you know. Was on a show when you were a kid at this point, because it was a long time ago for these kids. You watched this in elementary school, but they're still around and they're still doing this. So it's something that, you know, it's complicated, but I think that we're not the only ones doing this. Other teams who are writing books for other languages and are Spanish are all doing this too, and trying to figure out how to make those classroom resources as wide and inclusive as possible. And I think that it's going to be very interesting in 2030 to pick up Spanish textbooks and see where we're at. Jenna and then Bruce.
What does testing and assessment look like? Are you taking...
Well, we haven't figured that part out yet. We're just writing the book right now.
So I'm just curious, you know, when you write, so, you know, when you're correcting an essay, you know, do you allow all forms? Do you know, how do the online, you know, icon tests, you know, take this? Do you include, do you include a question and say conjugate it from, or make it fit for all of these different scenarios?
I think that we will. I think that we will, because honestly, at this point, the book that we use has the vosotros in it. And guess what? There are less people on this planet who use the vosotros than there are people who use the ella pronoun. So like, the vosotros is used in Spain, and that's it. We should, and I mean, we're also talking about putting the vos in our book, because there are more people who use the vos as a singular secondary pronoun than there are people who use vosotros as a plural secondary pronoun. So like, these are the sorts of things you have to think about, is like how to make this as inclusive. And I think that we will end up probably putting at least smidgens of that on our assessments to make sure that our students understand those things, but again, with an eye towards how do we change these things and iterate on these things in case the currents of the language change along with it. That's the tricky part.
What about y'all? What do you guys do for assessment? Or do you have any kind of assessment?
I accept all forms, but yeah, I haven't thought about assessing like these topics specifically. But when students do an assignment, if they use another form, like the e-form, that's okay for me.
Yeah, definitely not in charge of the eye contact. So, but if a student is using it in their like
Their
questions
projects or
section.
whatever,
The
yeah.
projects or like the questions like yo soy, whatever, in terms of adjectives, whatnot, that's a full 100% for me, in terms of like that kind of, but that's more like an isolated kind of example for those specifics. But yeah, I would love to see it. I have had, especially this semester, probably just like one or two students be like, oh, are we going to be tested on AGA? And I said, no, but I like that you're thinking about it. So, yeah.
Again, we're thinking about it for future tests.
Yeah.
We're just trying to get that book out the door, so those tests are not
Yeah.
changing, so we get that book out the door. What about French?
Yeah, I think it's similar, whereas I think I feel a little bit constrained by the tests at present, but in terms of writing, I'm open to all. I have taught them how to write with the median point, so like, yeah, like when you're writing out that adjective, including both the feminine and masculine versions of that, and if they do that, that's completely fine. Their mind tab homework marked it as wrong, so I have to go back in and change it as correct. But you know what, small steps, you know what I'm saying, so,
Indeed.
yeah.
Okay, Bruce, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just gonna say, we do now in German have one commercial textbook out that incorporates like the gender neutral neopronouns and has kind of in the way that they've written it, they kind of made a real point of trying to just work all sorts of diversity into the book. You know that they have just people who like of all different ages who look very different in terms of their ethnicity and racial backgrounds. People in wheelchairs, their disabilities are very, and the publisher has really marketed this book of, hey, look, we've tried to make a book that is including everyone, and the book seems to be doing really well. I mean, I know when I have the energy to switch textbooks again, it's going to be at the top of my list.
I mean, it's a process.
But I know people are talking about this book quite a bit because so I mean, I think that there's definitely interest in those kinds of in having those kinds of materials.
For sure. Is there anyone else who has any comments or questions for our roundtable panelists?
Well, I don't know what the other Spanish speakers think, but I feel like the use of X, well, which for me is still a common thing to do, I use it all the time. It's also a way of just sort of rejecting the gender, the grammar gender, right? Although it cannot be read out loud, it definitely in the words when you add it, it's like sort of like crossing that, crossing that possibility. So in that way, I feel there are many experimentations with how to reject the binaries in our language. And even though, I mean, I actually find it kind of beautiful to try to just change the written language because we are using it anyway all the time, right? In any social media, everywhere, there's words that are named. And so it has a lot of power. You really kind of read it out loud and you choose how to read it out loud. I see experimentations in that all the time. I also see people who just leave blank space in the words so that it becomes like two words or how do you call this? Like the hyphen but down.
Underscore.
Underscore, yeah. So I think there's that. And also I've been in speeches that are like sort of political speeches in which people use for adjectives, they start using the feminine adjectives and then they switch to a masculine, like back and forth. So they feel like they're addressing everyone. So there's that too. Like I've seen it in Spanish from people who are not, related to languages. They're just trying to address all.
That's why my go-to greeting for people in Spanish is camarada, because it's gender neutral. Everyone's my comrades. Let's go, comrades, it's gender neutral. It's great, it's great. I love doing it. Yes?
I would say, I think that one of the reasons that there is a pushback from the X in Spanish is not only because of the pronunciation, but because queer spaces, especially now that they are developing a lot online, are trying to not only be like gender inclusive, but also decolonial or anti-colonial, and especially aware of people with disabilities. And the problem with the X is that when you have a vision disability, you usually use softwares that play on whatever you have on text. And the problem with using the X is that that could crash the softwares of people who have vision disabilities. And I think that is the reason why if you use the X is for certain words. For example, instead of saying amigos or amigues, some people would say amix with the X at the end. But I think that the beauty for me of growing up with this option of a non-cis hetero language is also the opportunity to decolonize the language. And that is why I think that we talk about the RAE so much, because at this point in time, why are we still thinking of the RAE as a pope?
That's a very good point. Well, I know that, like I said, we all want to go home for the weekend. Is there any last comment before we wrap up, though? Yes?
I have a quick question. So, in American media, there's been a recent push for increased representation. I was curious if you guys know of any examples or if there's a similar push for media in your guys' language for extra representation and that sort.
So yeah, actually Netflix France now when they dub or when they put subtitles, they've actually decided to start using gender inclusive language, and also Canal, which is like sort of like the HBO version. The version of HBO in France is also started. They just released a commitment, I think, this year to when they're dubbing and subtitling to actually, even if it's a masculine or feminine, to dub it in a gender neutral way. So there definitely has been, and a lot of the podcasts, as I mentioned before, either make up words, use gender neutral pronouns, create these oral circumlocution strategies to be basically like, fuck whatever's given to me, I'm going to create something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I feel about Spanish, too. I can't think of much off the top of my head, to be perfectly honest.
Also just being like the white transgender kind of human language. So honestly, there's not much, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, there are Spanish TV series that portray like very diverse groups, but also, I don't know if that's media too much, but we know there are some like attempts to write literature using the E, for example. I know there's a whole novel that came out last year, and recently we saw like a poem book, remember? The one Anna showed us, and I don't know, I intend to use it in the things I write.
Well, I think that's one of the wonderful things about the written language is how quick it can be to adopt those, because the barrier to release is so much lower than it would be for, say, I mean, this is what's so great about podcasts, too. This is why you see a lot of this evolution happening in podcasts. Releasing a podcast is as easy as me pulling up Audacity on a computer and finding a microphone. Like, I can find a place to release it for free. I can pay a very small amount a month if I wanted to be able to list it on Apple Podcasts or, you know, any of those locations. So the barrier to entry is much smaller, and I think the same is true of writing, because there are so many self-publishing houses, there are so many editoriales, like publishers who are willing to take a chance on smaller run things because so much can be done electronically at this point. You know, they're like, oh sure, we would love to print your poemario, your poem collection, or your novel that really pushes the boundary of language, because like it's cool, and it's not like, this is not like $100 million production that we got to figure out here. This is like, and that's why I think those sorts of areas can be kind of a vanguard of that, because the barrier to entry is so low, nearly non-existent, other than I need power in the internet.
Yeah. That's just a quick question to the panel members and maybe the public in general. Has anybody gotten any pushback from students on this? No way. Yeah, that's what I was interesting.
Most more so like, thank you for bringing
Great.
this up. Yeah, which is, and if they got an issue, talk to me about it.
Yeah.
Talk to me about it. I think also maybe because, this is just for me as well, being like a very open trans man, like if there is an issue with it, they might not want to express that, at least in my classroom. Yeah.
It makes it a little easier when you're like, oh, you're dehumanizing me personally.
Yeah. You know, what are you gonna say? But
yeah,
that's just me. It's the Bostonian.
What I do in my classes what I do is that I just give the simplest explanation the way I learn it. I write on the blackboard, I write el señor de los anillos. Okay, everybody, let's do it in feminine. So everybody goes like, la señora de los anillos. And I'm just like, okay, you see? You don't have to change los anillos because it's already masculine. They're just like, uh-huh. So how can we do it inclusive? So we put e. So, le señore de los anillos. And they like it and they say like, oh, okay, cool. But that's it. But of course, me and the other one, you know, an old person teaching like, oh, that, something like it.
Yeah, I actually feel it's way easier to learn it when you're just learning the language, when you're first learning the language, than because it's not so much a political question.
Sure.
It's more like, oh, it's another way of conjugating things. Let's do it.
Which is why it's so important to include it from the get-go.
Remember, oh my God, this is feminine, masculine,
Yeah.
what am I doing? It's just the same ending, so it's more like English almost in that sense, right? I agree from the beginning.
And also the fact that you don't, the TAs don't have any control over the icon, but when you send messages, I don't know if my dear Portuguese students have noticed it, but sometimes I put querides estudiantes, okay, estudiantes, o también queridas estudiantes. ¿Sí? Entonces, cositas así, chiquititas, little by little, but for everybody to feel better.
I think it's also worth mentioning that, like, really, if they want to be confident in the language, they need to know gender-inclusive language. For example, I've had 3 kids come in and say, Abby, I found a French TikTok. There's gender-inclusive language. Let's talk about it, right? And, like, that is their, like, forum for content, and what's being reflected there is gender-inclusive. It's progressive, and
For sure.
it's like a complete, I think, swerve from the textbook in that way. Yeah.
Was there any last comment before we wrap up? Well, I would just like to thank you all for attending. I feel like this was a great inaugural event for our gender inclusive workshops this semester. And very excited to see some other stuff that we're going to be talking about. Probably late March, early April is when we'll have our next event. Me and Will Coghill-Barons down in the Education College are talking about trying to do a joint event between him and us and what they're doing down in education, so that we can kind of, again, talk about that even to a more, to a higher level. How are we teaching this? And how are we teaching people who will teach this? Because that's, you know, where Will is coming from in a lot of respects, where they're training people who are going to be instructors. How do we teach them to then use this language when they get, you know, to the point where they're also teaching other people? But again, thank you all for coming, and thank you to my 3 panelists so much for your. And have a great weekend. Yay.